So this episode is about it's about the structural economic shift that most policymakers refuse to name. So do I. And platforms begin by creating value. You remember the first periods of most platforms like Facebook. They subsidize users in that phase. They empower developers, reduce transaction costs. They actually accelerate innovation in that phase, and democracies celebrate them. Then incentives change. Growth slows, investors demand returns, gatekeeping replaces openness. APIs close, and fees rise, ranking algorithms shift. Value stops flowing to users and businesses, it starts flowing upward. Cory Doctorow calls this enshittification. He is our guest today. And this is not only a cultural critic, it's a political economy transition. Because when value extraction replaces value creation, you get slower innovation, you get SMEs to lose their place in the market, you get public digital infrastructures becoming privately controlled, and you get democracies, reinforcing that same model through funding, procurement, and regulatory hesitation. That's a good one. Regulatory hesitation. Europe is particularly good at that. So the question we are exploring today is simple but uncomfortable. Why do democratic systems keep financing platforms after that innovation phase, after that phase already peaked and they enter the extraction phase? And what does that mean for long-term competitiveness, productivity, and resilience? And what does that mean for you, researcher, entrepreneur, innovator? Let's go for the episode. This episode of InnovEU, the EU Project Chronicles, is brought to you by my new book, Transition Science in the Economy. In it, I use data from more than 180 countries and 150,000 observations, data points, to show how five global shifts, five global transitions, the digital, the green, the new globalization, the transition to a war economy, and the housing crisis transition, how these five transitions are collapsing the middle class and rewriting prosperity and power. So if you want a clear map of today's economy and economic chaos, search for Transition Science in the Economy on Amazon and get your copy. Okay. So welcome to InnovEU, the EU Project Chronicles. Today we're talking with Cory Doctorow. He's an author, I think we can say he's an activist, and he's mostly a renowned thinker on digital platforms, interoperability, and what he calls enshittification, the forces that shape how online systems have evolved over time. So I'm very happy he accepted to come to the podcast, and I'm really eager for this discussion. And let's start. Cory, welcome to InnovEU, and thank you for being here. I would like to start by grounding our conversation in your thinking. So if you could please, for listeners who might not be familiar with your ideas,
Sure.
which have given practitioners a powerful vocabulary to understand what's gone wrong, if you could please briefly explain your core concepts, especially, I don't know,
Sure.
enshittification and maybe interoperability, you know better.
Sure. Yeah, so I should say I'm starting my 25th year working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is, I think, the world's premier digital rights group, and was formerly their European director. And so that means that I spent most of my adult life trying to get people to care about tech policy questions. And the problem with tech policy questions is that they tend to be abstract and relate to consequences that are going to happen a long time in the future. And people are, for extremely good reasons, mostly interested in things that are concrete and about to happen to them right now. And the problem is that by the time tech issues are concrete and about to happen to you right now, it's because something terrible is about to happen and it's too late to solve it. So you spend a lot of time trying to find ways to engage the public and raise the salience of these issues. And, I'm a science fiction novelist, so sometimes that's fiction, and sometimes it's parables, and sometimes it's framing devices, and sometimes, it's a dirty word. Giving people a minor license to vulgarity turns out to be a very successful way to engage them with these subjects. And so I coined this term enshittification to talk about platform decay, the visible, extremely pernicious and frightening decay of these platforms that we care about, that we use, that we can't seem to liberate ourselves from. And the idea comes in three pieces. There's a descriptive part about how the platforms fall apart, the characteristic decay of the platforms. There's a theoretical part that describes how the platforms have all come to be in this position where they're all falling apart at the same time. But then there's a proscriptive part, a set of policy prescriptions that I think would make the difference. And so the descriptive part is pretty straightforward. Platforms are first good to their end users. They find their ways to a way to lock those end users in. That's stage one. In stage two, because they know the users are locked in and can't readily depart, they make things worse for those users in order to tempt in business customers and deliver value to them at the expense of end users. And then they lock them in as well. And then in stage three, they claw back all the value for themselves. They leave enough value latent in the platform that users find it hard to depart, and therefore businesses can't leave because they're dependent on those users. And so, this dynamic of platform economics where a monopoly where you have control as a seller is leveraged into a monopsony where you have control as a buyer, and then is used to squeeze both sides of the transaction, I think represents something of an advance on what I think of as a fairly simplistic and really maybe credulously faithful in capitalism idea that the problem is that advertising-based services don't see you as their customer, and so they abuse you. If you're not paying for the product, you're the product. I think that's very simplistic. We know about ways that, for example, Apple abuses its customers after they give them €1,000 for a phone, and John Deere abuses farmers after they give them €600,000 for a tractor. Dignity is not something you get as a customer loyalty perk. And so that raises the question, why did platforms used to treat us with dignity, and why aren't they doing it anymore? And I think the best way to understand that is to ask yourself why firms didn't abuse us before. Not out of sadism, but out of self-interest. If you want to run kind of the platonic ideal of a firm, you run a firm that charges everything for its outputs, but pays nothing for its inputs. And that's academic publishing. But other businesses don't have that advantage. They have to accept discipline. They are disciplined by markets, so competitors will swoop in and poach customers, workers, and suppliers if your offers are anti-competitive or sub-competitive rather. And you have regulators, the discipline of states, who will step in and punish you for abusing your workers or your customers or your suppliers or engaging in otherwise nefarious conduct. And the problem here is that our policymakers failed us. It's not that the people who run these companies, these kind of ketamine-addled Zucker-Muskian failures, are evil, although they are. It's that we have an enshitogenic policy environment that selects for the worst people and rewards them for doing the worst things they can think of. And so when our policymakers ceased to enforce competition law meaningfully during the neoliberal era of Thatcher, Reagan, Helmut Kohl, Brian Mulroney, and so on, they allowed a string of mergers that over the following 40 years created cartels, duopolies, monopolies in virtually every sector of our economy, not just tech. And then this has this knock-on effect that it neutralizes regulators, because when a sector is composed of 100 firms, small and medium-sized enterprises, they're a rabble. They can't agree on anything. They're at each other's throats. When you have a regulatory proceeding asking for input or help developing a factual record about what a policy should be, they can't speak with one voice. If one of them tells a parochial lie in service to their business model, a rival with a different business model will present evidence that they're lying, right? And when you boil that sector down to 5 or 4 or 3 or 2, of course, just one company, not only do they have lots of surplus capital because they're not forced to engage in what Peter Thiel so charmingly calls wasteful competition, but also they are able to divide up the markets, right? So you see like Apple and Google dividing up search and mobile, where Google just gives Apple $20 billion a year in exchange for Apple not entering the search market. And that leaves them with all this surplus capital, but also with a unity of purpose. Because where 100 companies can't agree on anything, 5 companies agree on nearly everything. And so they show up at the commission, they show up in Congress and the various parliaments, and they tell the same lie with one voice, and they have the money to make that lie very loud and palatable. And then, if you're talking about tech and not just all the other sectors that have been corrupted, because they all have, whether we're talking about structural steel or vitamin C or, professional wrestling, you're talking about sectors with just a handful of firms that have made their products worse at the expense of everyone. But tech also had to accept 2 other forces of discipline. One was the tech workforce, which was uniquely composed in that despite the fact that it wasn't unionized, it was very powerful, because tech workers were highly productive. An engineer was worth more than $1 million a year to a big tech firm. And there weren't enough of them, which means that the last thing you want is for an engineer to walk out the door because $1 million walks out with them, and you can't find anyone to replace them. And so these engineers were treated extremely well. And oftentimes they use that power they had to defend users of technology. So many technical people find their way into technology by having revelatory experiences through their use of technology, right? They discover who they are and the words to describe how to understand the world. They escape the narrow confines of the circumstances of their birth. And especially when we're talking about a very high-paid field like tech, you might have people who grew up with very narrow life prospects who, thanks to tech, have found their ways into very expansive ones. And so, they seek to defend their users' interests, and they had the power to do it because the bosses couldn't replace them. So they could say, no, I'm not going to shitify that product. I missed my mother's funeral to ship on time because I believed in it so much. And if you don't like it, you can fire me, but you're not going to get someone else to do my job, and the guy across the street will give me a job by lunchtime. But these tech workers, they never consolidated the power they had as from scarcity into the power they could get from solidarity. They thought they weren't workers. They thought they were temporarily embarrassed founders. And so, never having formed unions, as soon as supply caught up with demand, those workers just met with mass layoffs and a complete gutting of their power. We've seen 500,000 tech layoffs in the US in the last 36 months. So no one says go to hell to their boss anymore, because their boss just fires them or replaces them with one of 10 engineers standing at the door. And then finally, there's interoperability, this fourth force, which you mentioned in your question. Interoperability really is, I think, one of my favorite sources of discipline on firms because it's so pluralistic. Lots of people can wield interoperability to redress the kind of wicked deeds of firms. It's a very distributed source of power. And interoperability is latent in digital technology. We only know how to make one kind of computer. It's the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, the computing engine that can compute every valid program, which means that any program that's adverse to your interests in a device or service you rely on has a counter program that can remediate the defect. If a tech boss installs a 10-foot pile of shit in your device from Silicon Valley, a programmer in, Germany can supply you with a 4-meter ladder that can handily go over it, and they can distribute that instantaneously and at zero cost to everyone in the world. And so when firms took steps to make their products worse, raising the price of ink or increasing the load of ads or spying on people more or taking away a feature that you loved and then selling it back to you as a subscription or any and all of the above, they historically just tempted new market entrants. Sometimes commercial market entrants and sometimes non-commercial market entrants, just users who are so furious at having been abused that they built a piece of software that fixed the thing and then released it as freeware, shareware, free and open source software. And so tech bosses always have to look over their shoulders because at any moment, someone could show up and usurp the relationship they had with customers and workers and suppliers by offering a technology that, stepped in to remediate their callow, poor decisions. And what happened was that the US banned modifying technology without permission from the manufacturer through something called an anti-circumvention law. The first of these was passed in 1998. And then the US Trade Representative made it their business to arm twist all of America's trading partners into passing versions of this. So here in the EU, we have Article 6 of the Copyright Directive, which was passed in 2001. And the quid pro quo there was that if you don't pass this, we're going to stick tariffs on your exports. But if you do pass this anti-circumvention law and agree to neutralize your entrepreneurs and your technologists and to leave the people in your territory helpless against the predatory conduct of American tech firms, you can export all your other products to America without tariffs. And so this brings us to this moment where Trump he's inherited a poker game that was rigged in his favor, and he flipped over the table anyway because he resents having to pretend to play. And so now he's whacking everyone with tariffs. And it raises the question, why would you go on forsaking the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue you could get from fixing America's defective tech exports if you're going to pay tariffs anyway, especially if America is going to weaponize its technology infrastructure and shut down your courts or your government or even the tractors in your country if you displease Trump, because all that technology is tethered to the American cloud and it can be neutralized or bricked, or its users can be locked out of it at a single word from Trump. And we've already seen Microsoft do that to the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Yeah. You mentioned Europe, and the European speech is a little bit more about regulation than in America.
Yeah.
Does that help? Does the European regulation make it different? Did the GDPR, did GDPR help in any way?
So GDPR is a really interesting example of one of the ways that European regulatory frameworks don't work, and that is a problem of European federalism. Federalism is a difficult arrangement. I'm, like all the best Americans, Canadian, and we have our own problems with federalism. You have to have certain anti-majoritarian frameworks within any federation, because small states don't want to join a federation of large states if it's just one citizen, one vote, right? What hope does Luxembourg have against Germany and France in a federal arrangement, unless there's something counter-majoritarian where they maintain autonomy throughout the region? And so, in Europe, you have Ireland, which is a tax haven, one of many, Luxembourg, Cyprus,
Sure.
the Dutch to a certain extent, and so on. And to be a tax haven, you have to be a crime haven, because by definition, any company that can pretend that it's Irish this week could pretend to be Maltese next week, right? Sure. And so if you enforce other laws, they'll just up sticks. And so GDPR enforcement starts in Ireland. And the Irish Data Commissioner, to a first approximation, doesn't get out of bed. And when they do, they sit around in their underwear watching cartoons and eating breakfast cereal all day. You could not have a more captured institution, the Irish Data Commissioner. The new head of the agency is a former Meta executive. And one thing we know from Sarah Wynne Williams, the Meta whistleblower whose book Careless People came out last year, it's that executives at that level all sign non-disparagement agreements where they're not allowed to criticize Meta ever. So you have someone who's an executive in the Irish regulatory system, who's the prime regulator for Europe for GDPR compliance over Google and Meta, who's not allowed to criticize Meta, right? It's just crazy. And so eventually those cases get dragged into Austria or Germany by people like Max Schrems and Johnny Ryan, and there are great NGOs. But, for a decade, what you had with GDPR was that every European data brokerage and ad tech company was driven out of business, and good riddance, because they were all violating the law and they had no reason to exist. But then they left an open field for these giant American competitors whose version of compliance was laughable. And this is why when you're in Europe, every page you land on has got a dialog box asking you if you'll accept cookies. That's illegal under the GDPR. It shouldn't be there, right? You should be able to emit a browser signal that just says, "Don't spy on me." And then they just never. And so you just click a checkbox in your browser. Better yet, it comes with that checkbox pre-ticked that says "Don't spy on me." You have to find that checkbox and untick it to say "Please spy on me," a thing no one will ever do, right? And so you have GDPR enforcement failures. But there's another problem with tech regulation in Europe, and it has to do with Trump. Trump has made it clear that he's not even going to maintain the pretense that America will assist European authorities in enforcing law against American companies that they can't expect to collect fines from American companies that are, onshored to America's banks. If they sanction those firms in any way, they'll be met with hellacious flurries of tariffs, maybe shutdowns of their technology, maybe even threats to steal Greenland again. And so getting just a company like Apple to follow the law has proven to be transcendently hard. Under the Digital Markets Act, Apple was expected to open up its app store. So Apple's first response to this was, all right, we're going to open up our app store. Here's how it's going to work. European companies can run their own app stores, but we're going to charge them junk fees in excess of the 30% transaction fees that we currently charge. We are going to have the sole discretion over which European companies can offer app stores. We will have to approve every app in that app store. We can unilaterally delist any app store for any reason without any appeal. And when we do, we delete all the data and all the apps on all users' devices. And if we think a user has left the EU for 21 days, we'll delete all their apps and data, right? So the European Commission said, come on, that's not compliance. And so Apple said, oh, well, I'll tell you what, we're not going to sell devices in Europe anymore. Everyone kind of laughed at that. So now they just filed 14 pretextual lawsuits in Ireland. And they're just going to do what Facebook and Google did. Now, the interesting thing about interop is that it doesn't have to come from a mandate. It can be useful and efficient if it does, if the European Union says, all right, here is the rule. You have to support this API or this standard or what have you. But it can also come through what's called adversarial interoperability, reverse engineering. Mm-hmm. And, the only thing stopping Europeans from reverse engineering Apple devices or any other American device or service is Article 6 of the Copyright Directive. Again, something that we signed up to because they promised us no tariffs and then broke that promise. And while the European Commission has very little ability to compel Apple to do things, it has total discretion over whether Apple gets to use European courts to stop European companies from doing things. That's a thing that the Commission can do and the Parliament can do at their discretion. And indeed, you have the Digital Fairness Act currently being worked through, and this is a perfect place to slot in the Digital Fairness Act, where you say, you are not obliged to follow the Copyright Directive, Article 6 of the Copyright Directive, provided you're not violating the GDPR or labor or consumer rights, so long as you're doing so in order to enhance fairness, mm-hmm. right? And then you just carve it out. You can keep Article 6 of the Copyright Directive on the books, but you can override it with a section of the Fairness Act. And that's it's something that's very timely, would work very quickly, ties in with multiple agendas. So it's not just economic development, but it's also digital sovereignty. What's the use of building the Euro stack and installing a bunch of European servers and European data centers running European equivalents of Office 365 if the only way to migrate, a giant German ministry from Office 365 to the Euro stack is to copy and paste every document one at a time, right? So you need jailbreaking, you need reverse engineering, you need adversarial interoperability. And, if you just order Apple or Google to facilitate the departure of 500 million affluent European consumers, they'll tell you to go fuck yourself, and they'll retreat to Ireland and give you the finger, mm-hmm. right? Whereas if you withdraw this protection, well, you got any number of European technologists who've fled America one step ahead of an ICE agent who wanted to shoot them in the face or send them to a slave labor camp in Venezuela or El Salvador. And you've got capital looking for returns that isn't hoping that maybe AI will someday make millions of people unemployed and then they can start to make money on the trillions they've wasted. Or capital investment opportunities whose success isn't determined by how many Trump coins they buy. So you've got capital, you've got talent, you've got a geopolitical moment. This is the time to do it.
You mentioned you mentioned Apple, Google. So you mean that this phenomenon and shitification phenomenon didn't happen only with the social networks? Because
No.
I've seen a lot of people saying that. So what do you think? Do LLMs are they going that way? Will they be shitified as well?
So you've already got them putting ads in them and self-preferencing and so on. The problem with LLMs is that, their first approximation, they're not real, right? They've spent between $600 and $700 billion so far on capital expenditures. Their
Huge amount.
annual revenue, annual revenue is $60 billion a year by their own account worldwide across all the AI companies. But that number it's a lie. So 10 billion of the 60 billion, just one line item, and there are others, is the $10 billion that Microsoft gave to OpenAI and then OpenAI gave back to Microsoft. That's not revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, to call that an accounting trick is to do violence to the noble accounting trick, right? And so you have a sector whose capital, the GPUs and the data centers amortize, well, they're amortizing them over 5 years, but they have to rebuild them every 2 years because the data centers, there's a new brand of GPU or a new model of GPU every year. The GPUs themselves burn out every 2 years. The GPUs are so specific in terms of power needs and layout and cooling needs and networking needs that you can install next year's GPUs in this year's data centers, although NVIDIA says they're going to start doing that someday. And so, you've got 2 years to make back $700 billion at $50 billion a year. And, anything that can't go on forever eventually stops, right? Like, someday they run out of suckers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny to watch Elon Musk do this. So he bought Twitter, is forced to buy Twitter, and he was losing gigantic amounts of money on Twitter. So then he merged Twitter with XAI, and he raised a bunch of capital for XAI, which is losing even more money than Twitter was, like far more money, like $8-10 billion a year. And now he's merging XAI with his rocket ship company. He's hoping for a $1.5 trillion IPO. And he's just bailing out suckers from one grift with the next grift's money. It's just a Ponzi scheme. And no one can explain how it's going to make money. The AI can't do anyone's job, although bosses can easily be convinced to fire people and replace them with chatbots that can't do their job, because bosses are infinitely horny to fire workers and replace them with automation, and that's been true since the Industrial Revolution. So I won't say that there aren't useful things you can do with AI. I just don't think there's $2 trillion worth of useful things you can do with AI. And maybe after the sector implodes and the 31% of the American S&P 500 that is 7 AI companies that are passing around the same $100 billion IOU really quickly and pretending it's in all of their bank accounts at once. Maybe after that falls apart and the economy collapses and 2008 looks like the best day of your life, maybe when we can buy GPUs for 10 cents on the dollar and hire as many applied statisticians as we want for cheap, and we've got open source models that we can optimize because they haven't put any energy into that, maybe we'll find a bunch of useful things that are cost effective to do. So many of the useful things you can do with AI are not cost effective. Mm-hmm. I was talking to a friend of mine who runs an NGO. It's doing really interesting human rights work using Claude Code, just writing big statistical analysis tools to crunch huge data sets related to human rights. And he was saying, like, this has made me like dozens of times more effective. And I'm like, would you pay $2,000 a month for it, for you and everyone who works at the org? And he was like, no. Mm-hmm. Right. So long as you're being subsidized, it's great. Like, Uber is great if the Saudi royal family are going to lose 41 cents on every dollar subsidizing the Uber to the tune of $13 billion or $31 billion over 12 years. But like, when Uber costs 3 times as much and pays the drivers half as much, it stops being so attractive, And so that's I think the problem with AI. Like, whatever effect it's going to have is going to be a long way off. Mm-hmm. They're not going to get the returns that they think they're going to get. They're not going to get the improvements they think they're going to get. They say, oh, if we shovel more words into the word guessing program, it'll wake up and become intelligent. That's like saying, if we keep breeding these horses to run faster and faster, one of them will eventually give birth to a locomotive. Like, it's just not how intelligence works.
That's not very optimistic for the evolution of the world's economy. You basically
No. It's like, get out of all your current stocks and invest in long poles so you can dig through rubble for canned goods.
You're saying we're speeding towards a cliff.
100%. Yeah. No, this is and it's, we have form, right? Like, we've been doing this with the climate emergency forever. It's not like this is new, right? We like, speeding towards cliffs is our civilizational speciality.
Well, let me get back to research and ask you, how should people shift their research agendas to incorporate these platform interoperability concerns? Should they? Can they?
Yeah, no, I think they should. I think that there's this big open question about how far you can get with reverse engineering without cooperation from the platforms. The platforms themselves will say they're impregnable, but the thing is that when you have the law to protect you from adversaries, right? From commercial adversaries, from competitors, you don't need to invest in technology. If you're Mark Zuckerberg and someone's built an alt client for Instagram, like OG app, which did really well in the one day it was online before Mark Zuckerberg used takedown notices to have it taken off the internet, you walk out of your office, and to the right is a building full of lawyers, and to the left is a building full of engineers. The engineers are generating profits for you, and the lawyers are a cost center. So you walk into the engineering office and you say, stop whatever you're doing and start figuring out how to block this app. Or you walk into the law office and you say, go turn the people who funded this fucking app into a radioactive crater so that anyone who ever thinks about funding an app like this ever again knows what's coming for them and you know where you're going to go. And so it would be really interesting to have some technical meat on these bones about what we can do if we had a well-funded adversary that could operate above board and didn't have to worry about lawyers and only about engineers. And then what's the other research agenda? I think when it comes to ad tech, we have dramatically under-theorized what content-based advertising can do, targeting rather than behavioral targeting can do. Some of the preliminary research is pretty good. It'd be great to have more of that, because if we ever do have effective privacy regulation, we lose all targeting. And right now, the Coalition for Surveillance includes a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that rely on targeting. And so the question is, how close could you get for customer acquisition with content-based, non-surveilling? So that's just like if you're reading an article about shoes, you see ads for shoes, basically. So there's no privacy dimension there. How close could we get with that? And what could we do? Because that could break up the coalition against privacy law. And there was one other thing I was thinking of. I guess that's enough.
Okay. In your view, how can EU innovation policy, what can the European Commission do with all the money they spend on research and on these EU programs? What can they do to shape global norms and put some morality in all of this?
Yeah, well, I think that we're looking at Eurostat kind of turning that into reality right now. There isn't really any reason for there to be 6 different kinds of office productivity suites. What makes a lot more sense is for there to be a free and open source one that sits on a Git server, not a GitHub server run by Microsoft, but a Git server that lots of people contribute to. We treat it more like a science than a product, right? Where it's, there's a scholarly body that determines the, alloys that you put into structural steel members and joists that go over people's heads, and it's an international practice. They have conferences, the standards, although they differ in minor ways from region to region, they're all grounded in the same science. That's what the European Union could be doing. It sort of seems like what they're headed for with Eurostat. But that is so complementary to an export sector that builds migration tools, that does adversarial interoperability. And the two really work together very well. And so it's rare, I think, that you have such an obvious path to do what I guess in the universities they call technology transfer, but commercialization of research, where on the one hand you're doing UI research and localization and optimization, scaling research, even ethnographies of systems administrators to find out what the pain points are for scaling up an office suite to 10,000, 100,000, or 1 million users, right? All of these things that are kind of currently held within the body corporate of a half dozen giant American companies that could then just become a source of public inquiry. But that then creates a market for delivering all that stuff as a service with tools that suck the data out of these American silos and put them into these European platforms.
Okay, and to put an end to the interview, what's your view? What could researchers, innovators in Europe do in the next months to deal with this and take advantage of this situation, of this evolution?
It starts with policymakers, right? Your hands are tied. You can't do adversarial interoperability for so long as Article 6 of the Copyright Directive remains intact. And you won't force interoperability from these firms for so long as Trump is going to show up and threaten to take Greenland every time you try. So what you have to do is assemble yourselves as a polity and make yourself heard in Brussels and in Strasbourg and in the national capitals to say their trillions could be our billions, right? Like, European powers have a long history of going to other countries and digging up their wealth and bringing it back to Europe, right? You could be doing this with America's wealth. Those companies need to be relieved of the money on their balance sheet. It's a danger to themselves and others. They are so out of ideas that they're pissing it all up against the wall on stock buybacks and AI nonsense, right? Like, for their own good, they need to have this money taken away from them, right? We need to make the policies that let us take their money and save them from themselves.
You put a lot of importance on that Article 5. Do you think that's really the key?
Yeah. Yeah, I really do. I mean, there's other stuff, patent and trademark and copyright and trade secrecy and so on. But all of those things have much more well-defined what in copyright circles we call limitations and exceptions, fair dealing, de minimis, blah, 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 blah. No exceptions for anti-circumvention.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, I sell you an audiobook on Audible, which is Amazon's platform, that I wrote, read aloud, financed, and then I provide you with the tool to take it off Audible and take it somewhere else. I, the copyright proprietor, commit a felony because Amazon, not me, has the authority to decide what that file, that copyrighted work that I am the sole proprietor of, what its destiny can be. So in the absence of any kind of limitation or exception, this blanket prohibition on circumvention has become a tool by which dominant firms can conjure up a kind of felony contempt of business model, where any conduct they disprefer can be converted into a jailable offense. So all they have to do is sort of skin the parts of the product you would need to access to modify it with a technical protection measure. Because removing the technical protection measure is a crime, anything you do to change the product becomes a crime too. So we have to get rid of this. It is a moral hazard. It invites firms to enshittify. We have to get rid of it.
Okay. I take your point, and I really believe that too. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you
Nice to
for
talk to you,
joining
Fernando.
us.
All right.
I hope things will go the right way, but
I
I'm
hope so
not
too.
very confident as well.
Things change. You know, we got 30 seconds left, but remember, 3 years ago, Europe was 15 years behind its climate goals. Now it's 10 years ahead because crises precipitate changes,
Yeah.
and Trump generates crises at scale.
It does.
So this is our chance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So what you just heard from Cory Doctorow describes a predictable economic cycle. Platforms create surplus, they consolidate control, and phase-free, they extract rent. Through the AWTY lens, this is not only a digital story, it affects all 5 transitions. Green transition, energy-intensive AI clusters are scaling without systemic constraints. Housing transition, tech concentration inflates euro prices. Globalization, the new globalization, dependency shifts from diversified trade to platform gatekeepers. It also affects the war economy, the transition to a war economy, because dual-use digital infrastructure centralizes strategic leverage, and you can see the impact these infrastructures have on nowadays wars. And when extraction dominates creation, composite resilience declines. Digital scores may remain high, and systemic health weakens underneath that. This is the illusion democracies struggle to detect. So before funding or supporting any platform-based ecosystem, ask one structural question. Where is value flowing 3 years from now? If most projected value accrues to a single gatekeeper, you are reinforcing extraction, not value creation and not innovation. So redesign incentives, embed interoperability, the word so dear to Cory Doctorow. Embed interoperability, protect exit options. This is how you preserve innovation capacity. I hope you enjoyed the episode.